Imagine this: you're walking through the marble hallways of a Roman villa just as the sun is going down. Oil lamps flicker along the walls, making the painted frescoes look alive, almost as if the figures are moving in the shifting light. Behind thin curtains, you can catch soft whispers. Adomina and her slave girls are chatting about the beauty rituals they'll do tomorrow. The air is heavy with the smell of rose oil and burning incense, but there's also a sharp, metallic scent that feels out of place, almost unsettling. From one of the private rooms, a senator's wife steps out. Her face is covered with white powder made from lead, and her lips shine a deep red from mercury-based makeup cosmetics that slowly poisoned her body, though she didn't know it. She glides gracefully down the corridor toward her husband's study, where guests are waiting. On the surface, it looks elegant, but every step she takes is tied to traditions and expectations that feel so strange to us, now so strange they sound more like dreams or nightmares than real history. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten parts of Roman life, I'd love it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more hidden stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? It amazes me that we're sharing these ancient stories together, even though we're scattered across the world, connected by nothing more than curiosity about the past. Now here's the part that might surprise you. What we think of today as private or intimate things like family life, romance, and personal habits were lived in ways that would completely challenge how we understand human nature. In Rome, these things weren't private quirks. They were part of the system, woven into the laws, religion, and traditions of everyday life. Power, gender, and sexuality all followed rules that, to us, might feel both shocking and fascinating. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD and buried Pompeii under ash, it didn't just freeze buildings in time, it preserved the secrets of Roman life. Archaeologists later uncovered bedrooms with daring wall paintings, bathhouses where social rank decided who bathed where, and private rooms where the lines between love, pain, and power blurred in ways that still make us uneasy today. Take the Roman idea of pudicitia. We usually translate it as chastity or modesty, but in Rome, it meant so much more. For women, it wasn't simply about staying pure. It was about finding the exact balance society demanded being available to their husbands, but completely off limits to other men. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflection of their husband's honor and social rank. One famous example was Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus. She was seen as the perfect model of Roman womanhood. But behind closed doors, she was also known to gather secrets from slave girls in powerful households. She understood that gossip about private lives could change political futures, and in Rome, even bedroom whispers could topple an empire. Marriage itself in Rome often had little to do with love. For the elite, it was like signing a contract alliances between families to secure money, political power, and heirs. If love grew later, that was just considered a lucky bonus. In many cases, couples barely knew each other until their wedding night. That first night carried heavy pressure. In a letter from 97 AD, the writer Pliny the Younger describes the wedding of a girl just 14 years old. Her mother and aunts dressed her and explained duties she could hardly understand. Meanwhile, her new husband, 20 years older than her, waited in the next room. That single evening changed her from child to wife forever. The marriage bed was more than just a bed in ancient Rome, it was almost a sacred stage. It had been blessed by the family gods, sprinkled with holy water, and draped in red cloth. That red wasn't chosen at random. It was meant to hide the blood that proved a girl's virginity was gone after her wedding night. Roman views on sex were very different from how we think today. They didn't just divide people into men and women. Instead, they saw people through categories: citizens, non-citizens, slaves, freedmen, and foreigners. Each group had different rights, different rules, and even different sexual expectations. For example, A Roman citizen man could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without much judgment. But if he touched the wife or daughter of another citizen, the punishment could be deadly. One man, Gaius Silius, learned this the hard way in 48 AD. He secretly married Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, while the emperor was away. Whether the marriage was real, in a legal sense, didn't matter. The act itself was seen as a direct challenge to Claudius's power. When the emperor returned, both Silius and Messalina were executed, not just for adultery, but because their relationship was seen as a threat to Rome's political order. Slavery made things even more complicated. In Roman households, slaves were considered part of their master's body, meaning their owners could use them sexually whenever they wanted. Consent didn't matter, and there was no law to protect slaves from abuse. Wealthy families often had slaves for different intimate roles. Some prepared beauty treatments, some served in the bedroom, and others were kept as concubines, living as partners outside of legal marriage. Take Marcus Crassus, one of the richest men in the 1st century BC. He reportedly had more than 500 slaves in his city household alone. Many were chosen for their beauty and trained not just for housework, but also for singing, poetry, and sexual service. Writers from that time hint at strange evening rituals where slaves entertained guests with music and recitations, and also performed sexual acts that blurred the line between party, religion, and exploitation. Bathhouses were another place where Rome's social and sexual rules played out. They weren't just for washing up, they were the heart of social life. People exercised, gossiped, made business deals, and yes, arranged sexual encounters. Men and women usually bathed separately, but in the mixed spaces nearby, flirtations and quiet negotiations often led to private meetings later. Seneca the Younger, a philosopher writing around 60 AD, even complained about living above a noisy bathhouse. He described the constant racket, men grunting while lifting weights, the sharp slaps of hands during massages, screams from painful hair removal sessions, and beneath it all, the low voices of men bargaining with attendants for sexual favors. His irritation gives us a glimpse into a world where sex wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was woven into public life. And speaking of hair removal, Romans were almost obsessed with it, especially the wealthy. Both men and women went through painful treatments to stay smooth. They used heated tweezers, sticky wax made from pine resin, and even rough pumice stones rubbed directly on the skin. Rich households often kept slaves called lipulari, whose only job was to remove body hair. The poet Martial once wrote about watching a senator's wife endure one of these brutal sessions. She lay perfectly still while her slave girl plucked hair from her arms, legs, and even her most private areas with hot bronze tweezers. Tears streamed down her face, but she stayed silent. A Roman matron was expected to show strength, never weakness, not even under that kind of pain. The beauty routines of Roman women were nothing short of brutal. A single hair removal session could take hours. By the time it was over, the woman's skin was raw, bleeding, and burning. But to Roman eyes, it looked perfect, smooth, hairless, and socially acceptable. Pain was simply the price of fashion. The cosmetics they used were even more dangerous. To get the pale, porcelain-like skin that showed you were wealthy enough to stay indoors, women painted their faces with a paste made of white lead mixed with vinegar. It looked glamorous at first, but over time it poisoned the body, causing brain damage, infertility, and even death. For rosy lips and cheeks, women crushed cinnabar, a mercury compound, and mixed it with oil and animal fat. It gave them a healthy glow while slowly destroying their nervous systems. Even their eyeliner was toxic. They used antimony, mixed with honey and wine, to darken their eyes. The poet Ovid, in his book Ars Amatoria around 02 AD, even included recipes for these beauty tricks. Reading them today feels like reading instructions for a slow and painful suicide. But beauty wasn't the only area where Roman women risked their lives. Birth control in ancient Rome was dangerous and unreliable. One of the most prized methods was a plant called silphium, harvested from the coast of Libya. It was so valuable it appeared on coins and was literally worth its weight in silver. Women used it in teas, powders, or oils, but the doses were so strong that too much could kill them. Other methods were just as risky: inserting wool soaked in vinegar or cedar resin before sex, or swallowing horrible mixtures of copper sulfate, iron rust, or even crushed beetles. Some women tried to prevent pregnancy by throwing themselves into violent exercise, scalding baths, or even intentional falls. Behind the cold, clinical notes of Roman doctors like Cyrannus of Ephesus, you can hear the desperation of women trying to control their own bodies in a society that gave them almost no choice. Abortion was technically legal in Rome. The fetus was seen as part of the mother's body, but the procedures were terrifying. Many women took poisonous plants like pennyroyal or rue, which didn't just end pregnancies, they poisoned the whole body. Others turned to mechanical methods where bronze tools were inserted into the womb. These often caused infection, bleeding, and fatal injuries. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, 77 AD, described one tragic case: a wealthy woman who, after days of swallowing herbs with no result, allowed a Greek doctor to perform the procedure while she bit down on leather and her female relatives held her still. The abortion worked, but she soon developed an infection and died in agony. Her family told the neighbors she died of a fever, too ashamed to admit the real cause. Roman views on sexuality, especially homosexuality, were also shaped by power rather than love. For Roman men, same-sex relationships were acceptable, but only if they followed strict rules. A citizen could take the active role with slaves, foreigners, or men of lower status without criticism. But being on the receiving end, being penetrated, was seen as shameful, weak, and even criminal, no matter how consensual the act was. Power defined everything. Even Julius Caesar wasn't spared from these social codes. Throughout his career, enemies mocked him with rumors that in his youth, he had been the passive partner of King Nicomed's IV of Bithynia. They called him the Queen of Bithynia and sneered that all his later military victories were just an attempt to cover up the humiliation of being seen as unmanly in Rome's rigid, unforgiving sexual hierarchy. In ancient Rome, people cared less about whether accusations were true and more about how much they could hurt someone's reputation. For Romans, power and respect were everything. Being seen as in control was a must for anyone in politics. If a man looked weak or submissive, people thought he wasn't fit to lead. That's why Emperor Hadrian's love for a young man named Antinous shocked so many. It wasn't just because the relationship was with another man, that part wasn't the issue. What bothered people was that Hadrian clearly cared deeply, almost too deeply, about him. To many Romans, this made it look like Hadrian had given up the dominant role expected of a ruler. When Antinous drowned in the Nile around 130 AD, Hadrian was so heartbroken that he made him a god and even built a city in his memory. Some Romans found this touching, but many saw it as an embarrassing show of romantic weakness. Sex and money were also closely tied in Roman society. Prostitution wasn't hidden, it was organized and even taxed. There were different types of sex workers, each with their own status. Meretresses were registered prostitutes who worked in brothels and paid taxes. And Sheila were enslaved women whose owners rented out their bodies. Femmes were women from wealthy families who had lost their respectability through scandals or affairs and slipped into prostitution. Places like the brothels in Pompeii, which were preserved under volcanic ash, show us what this life was like. The rooms were tiny stone cubicles, barely big enough for a small bed. On the walls, colorful paintings showed the acts on offer along with prices. Graffiti scratched into the walls included crude jokes, names of favorite workers, and even the occasional tender message. One carving read, "Restituta," "You move your hips so sweetly," reminding us that even in a business transaction, real human feelings sometimes appeared. Rome's Subura district was the heart of the city's nightlife. It was packed with brothels, taverns, and entertainment spots. Wealthy men, including senators and priests, often sneaked in after dark. To avoid being recognized, they dressed like commoners, hiding their rings and fine clothes. Ancient writers like Juvenal described how these men slipped into the shadows at night, only to return home at dawn, dressed again in their fancy togas, pretending to be men of strict morals. Even marriage in Rome often looked more like a contract than a love story. Among the rich, wedding agreements laid out detailed rules about sex, children, and property. Some contracts even spelled out how often a wife was expected to sleep with her husband. One from 134 AD stated that the wife had to meet her husband's desires at least twice a week unless she was sick, on her period, or performing religious rituals. She couldn't refuse unusual requests unless they caused injury or required others to join in. If she didn't follow the rules, money would be taken from her dowry as a penalty. Wedding nights were also filled with rituals meant to protect the couple and ensure children. The bride was carried over the threshold so no evil spirit could sneak in through her feet. Her hair was combed with a spear that had killed a gladiator meant to give her courage for childbirth. The bed was blessed by older women who had been married only once and had children, while little boys tossed nuts and fruits around to bring fertility. Roman poet Catullus even described the wedding scene where the bride sat quietly while older women undressed her from her childhood, clothed and dressed her in a saffron-colored wedding gown. Her face was painted with sacred clay, and her hair tied with ribbons, blessed by the household gods. She cried softly not from sadness, but from fear of stepping into an unknown world where everything in her life was about to change. On the wedding night, while the bride sat in her room surrounded by women, the groom waited in the next chamber with his male relatives. They poured him wine and gave advice, some of it thoughtful, some of it crude, about what he was expected to do before morning. For men, marriage was a duty, but also a privilege. For women, the rules were much harsher. In Rome, divorces were surprisingly simple. Either the husband or the wife could end a marriage just by declaring it over. But the consequences were not the same. A man who divorced could remarry almost immediately, often without losing anything. A woman, on the other hand, usually lost her children, much of her wealth, and often her good reputation. Even if she wasn't to blame, society judged her harshly, while men faced very little shame. The emperor, Augustus, tried to change this imbalance with new marriage laws in 18 BC. He forced men to marry and punished those who stayed single or divorced without reason. But instead of fixing the problem, the law made things worse. A black market in fake marriages appeared almost overnight. Some men would quickly marry their slave women, free them, and then claim they had followed the law. Others married women from faraway provinces, women they never actually planned to live with. On paper, they were married, but in reality, nothing changed. Roman festivals could also shock modern eyes. One of the most famous was the Floralia, held every April in honor of the goddess Flora. What started as a religious celebration of spring and fertility turned into a wild party. Theaters filled with performances that mixed music, dance, and open displays of sexuality. Prostitutes and freed women joined in eagerly, while respectable wives usually stayed away. Yet, Roman writers like Martial described the strange contradiction. The same citizens who condemned such behavior at home would cheer like mad in public as naked performers, danced and even coupled on stage. Senators sat side by side with slaves, all pretending that they were there for religion, not curiosity. The idea was that Flora blessed those who celebrated with complete freedom from modesty, and the crowd took that seriously. Roman medicine also reflected this mix of practicality and cultural belief. Doctors like Galen studied anatomy carefully and wrote detailed notes about sex and reproduction. but their advice often echoed social attitudes more than real science. They believed women needed to feel pleasure in order to conceive, yet they also warned that too much pleasure would make women wild and uncontrollable. Another physician, Cyrannus of Ephesus, gave instructions for midwives. He wrote that during childbirth, if labor was slow, the midwife should ask whether the woman had felt satisfaction during conception. If she had, the womb would open more easily and the baby would descend. If not, the birth might require extra help through herbs, massage, or other methods. He even noted that women who conceived through duty or force often suffered harder labors, while women who conceived in passion gave birth more smoothly. Sex education in Rome started young. Boys usually learned from older male relatives, tutors, or by direct experience with slaves. Their lessons focused on dominance and control. Girls, on the other hand, were taught by their mothers and older married women. Their training revolved around obedience, endurance, and the expectation to serve their future husbands. Pleasure or choice was rarely mentioned. For boys, coming of age meant more than just turning 16. At the toga virilis ceremony, they put away childhood clothing and wore the white toga of manhood for the first time. Families made sacrifices to household gods, and the boy's new status was announced publicly. But behind the scenes, there were private lessons too. These often included advice about sexual behavior, and in some cases, even arranged encounters at brothels or with experienced slaves to complete his education. Roman poetry gives us a window into the emotions of people trying to live within the strict rules of their society. The poet Catullus, for example, wrote with burning passion about his love for a woman he called Lesbia, who was likely Clodia Metelli, the sister of a powerful politician. His poems swing between pure joy and crushing jealousy, showing that, despite the stiff rules of Roman marriage, people felt the same overwhelming emotions we do today: love, desire, heartbreak, and anger. But even in his tender verses, Roman ideas about gender and power creep in. When things soured between him and Lesbia, Catullus's tone shifted. He lashed out with anger, threatening her and even her other lovers, using words of sexual violence to show his pain. In Rome, love and power were tied together so tightly that even the most affectionate relationships could quickly turn bitter and cruel if the balance of control was disturbed. Romans carried these ideas about love and loyalty even into death. Wealthy families built grand tombs for couples that showed husbands and wives reclining together, often with the wife's hand resting gently on her husband's chest. This gesture symbolized eternal faithfulness, as if to say that not even death could break their bond. Some tombs were more daring, decorated with erotic paintings and filled with objects meant for intimate use. Historians still argue whether these images were a reflection of the couple's earthly pleasures or hopeful signs that passion would continue in the afterlife. Either way, it's clear the Romans believed intimacy was something too important to be buried with the body. Views on aging and sexuality were also very different from what many of us expect today. Wealthy Roman men were expected to stay sexually active into old age, and many married much younger wives to ensure it. Women, however, were judged by a completely different standard. Widows were often pressured to remarry for practical reasons, but older women who still showed romantic or sexual interest were mocked. Satirists like Juvenal made fun of them in cruel ways. He once described the grandmother of 7 who abandoned her husband to chase after a gladiator in Egypt. She painted her wrinkled face like a young bride and wrapped herself in silk to hide her age, but the disguise fooled no one. The gladiator happily took her money and jewels, but when she reached for him, he pushed her away in disgust, muttering that some pleasures simply weren't worth the cost. Slavery made relationships even more complicated. Slaves couldn't marry legally, but many still formed strong emotional bonds within the households where they lived. Masters sometimes freed slaves they loved so they could marry them, but those relationships always carried the heavy shadow of power imbalance. Children born to enslaved women were considered the master's property, no matter who the father was, meaning families could be broken apart at any moment. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger once described his grief after the death of his slave, Zosimus. "He was more than a servant to me," Pliny wrote. "He was my companion. We shared meals, a bed, and secrets. When Zosimus fell ill, Pliny personally cared for him, refusing to leave him in the hands of other servants. After his death, Pliny freed Zosimus's son and built a tomb for him, calling him not property, but a beloved friend." Pliny even admitted that some people would think this level of affection was too much for a slave. But he didn't care. His grief was real, and it shows us how blurred the lines between slavery and intimacy could sometimes be. Roman law also shaped relationships in powerful ways. There were several forms of marriage, each with different rules. The most formal confarreatio was reserved for patricians, the elite class. This ceremony involved elaborate religious rituals, and once performed, divorce was nearly impossible. For wealthy Romans, marriage wasn't just about love or companionship, it was about family alliances, property, and honor. But as the poetry, tombs, and personal letters show us, behind all the laws and expectations, Romans still struggled with the same joys, fears, and heartbreaks that come with being human. In ancient Rome, marriage didn't always look the same. It could happen in different ways. One kind, called comtio, was like a symbolic purchase where the bride was officially transferred from her father's authority to her husband's. Another type, called iusius, worked more like common law marriage. If a woman lived with a man for a full year without leaving for more than 3 nights in a row, the law considered them married. These different methods meant that Roman couples had varying levels of legal protection and social approval. Wealthy families usually arranged the more formal marriages to protect inheritance and family status, while poorer couples often relied on simpler unions that required no ceremony or paperwork, though these offered fewer rights and protections. Roman ideas about sex were also very different from ours today. Some practices that were normal back then feel shocking or even disturbing now. For example, relationships between grown men and teenage boys were accepted as long as they followed strict social rules. The older man was expected to take the lead and also act as a mentor, teaching the boy about culture and knowledge. Romans saw this as educational rather than harmful, though today we know it was deeply unfair and damaging because of the power imbalance. Roman writers even described such relationships in detail. In one story written by Petronius around 60 AD, the narrator speaks about his young lover, Giton. He admits that Giton's beauty both delighted and tormented him. He wanted not just the boy's body, but also his thoughts and dreams. Yet, when other men looked at Giton with desire, he felt terrified rather than proud, afraid someone would steal what he thought was his. His love turned into possession, and he struggled to see whether he was protecting the boy or imprisoning him. Sex and religion sometimes mixed in surprising ways too. Certain temples had sacred prostitutes, women believed to act as go-betweens for worshippers and the gods. There were also extreme rituals in some cults, like that of the goddess Cybele. Her male priests would work themselves into such a frenzy of religious ecstasy that they castrated themselves, living the rest of their lives as women devoted to the goddess. These priests, called Galli, didn't fit into any normal category of Roman society. They weren't seen as male or female, citizen or slave. They were considered holy beings that stood apart from everyone else. Romans also used magic in their love lives. Archaeologists have found curse tablets where people begged the gods to make someone love them or stay faithful. One curse said, "I bind Gaius Lucius so he can think of nothing but Claudia, so he cannot eat, sleep, or rest until he comes to her bed." Love potions were also common, made from plants and animal parts, even though the law banned them. But these potions could be dangerous since it wasn't always clear if they were medicine, magic, or poison. Many people died from drinking mixtures they thought would make them more attractive or improve their performance. Attitudes about pleasure in Rome were also unequal. Men were encouraged to chase after sex and enjoy themselves, as long as they stayed in control and kept their social standing. Women, on the other hand, were expected to feel just enough pleasure to help with pregnancy, but not so much that they seemed wild or unfaithful. This pressure left many women anxious, afraid that showing too much or too little interest in sex could lead to gossip or even danger. Roman writers often showed how hard this was for women. In one of Ovid's poems, written around 15 BC, he describes a woman lying still during intimacy, doing her duty but showing no sign of enjoyment because she feared being judged. Yet, when he stopped, she cried, worried that her lack of passion had disappointed him. Roman wives had to walk a very thin line when it came to intimacy. If they showed too much passion, they risked being called immoral. But if they showed too little, they could be accused of being cold or unloving. Many women struggled to find a safe middle ground, often wrecking on one side or the other. Sex wasn't just a private matter for Roman households, it also extended to the lives of slaves. Masters controlled nearly every part of their slaves' relationships. They could forbid slaves from marrying, separate families, or even use sexual access to slaves as a form of reward or punishment. Some wealthy families went so far as to keep breeding records of their slaves, carefully noting traits like physical strength or intelligence, almost as if they were cataloging livestock. These records, written on papyrus and wax tablets, reveal just how completely the Romans stripped slaves of their humanity. The Roman army had its own sexual culture, shaped by the all-male environment of military life and the power soldiers held over conquered people. Soldiers were officially expected to remain celibate during campaigns, but this rule was broken often. Rape, temporary concubinage, and relationships with local women were widespread. Victory celebrations sometimes turned horrifying. For example, after Caesar's siege of Alesia, prisoners were divided among the soldiers. Some women were assigned as servants, while others were used for sexual purposes. Ancient writers noted how the sounds of women screaming that night mixed with the songs of triumph, painting a chilling picture of Rome as both a great empire and a brutal conqueror. Roman cities also reflected these attitudes towards sex and gender in their very design. Public buildings often had separate entrances for men and women. Private homes were laid out with clear hierarchies that dictated who could enter certain rooms, especially the private chambers where intimacy took place. These inner rooms were often decorated with frescoes and mosaics showing scenes of fertility, pleasure, and sometimes even violence. The famous Roman roads, built to connect the empire, also carried another kind of trafficked sexual commerce. Prostitutes, slaves, and entertainers traveled along these routes, following festivals, armies, and trade. Roadside inns often doubled as brothels, and traveling merchants expected sex to be available as easily as food and lodging. The Roman legal system also kept a close eye on sexual behavior. Laws weren't really about protecting people from harm. They were more about keeping order, controlling reproduction, and making sure social classes stayed in their proper places. Legal codes spelled out which sexual acts were allowed, who could be with whom, and what punishments were given for breaking the rules. Even the tax system showed how much Rome treated sex as an industry. Prostitutes paid taxes on their earnings, and brothel owners paid additional fees on their properties. Even private citizens caught committing adultery faced financial penalties, which conveniently filled the empire's treasury. In Rome, sex wasn't just personal, it was business, and the state profited from it. Architecture also made room for these practices. Public bathhouses often included private chambers where couples could meet in secret. Theaters had upper galleries where sexual encounters happened openly, though officials pretended not to notice. Even temples, places of worship, sometimes contained spaces for rituals that involved sex, believed to honor the gods. Finally, Roman art gives us a window into this world. Frescoes, mosaics, and sculptures preserved scenes of sexual activity that historians still study today. These artworks reveal just how much intimacy, whether in marriage, slavery, religion, or business, was woven into the daily life of ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, sexual imagery was everywhere. Frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, and even household decorations often showed explicit sexual acts images that would be considered pornographic today. Yet, for Romans, these displays were normal and socially acceptable. The walls of private homes were sometimes filled with these scenes, suggesting that Romans were far more open about sexuality than most later European cultures, which tended to hide such things. Philosophers in Rome also debated sex and pleasure, much like we do today. Stoics taught that people should practice moderation and self-control, believing that giving in too much to desire weakened the mind and distracted from higher goals. Epicureans, on the other hand, believed pleasure was natural and good, but they advised people to choose pleasures carefully, avoiding those that led to pain or trouble later. Even Marcus Aurelius, the emperor and philosopher, struggled with this balance. He compared desire to water, always flowing toward quick satisfaction. He said the mind must act like a dam, not to block all pleasure completely, but to guide it toward things that served a greater purpose. Desire itself wasn't evil, he believed, but like fire, it needed control, or it would burn out of control. Roman medicine had a surprising amount of accurate knowledge about the body, but it was mixed with cultural biases and superstitions. Doctors understood the basics of reproduction and even developed surgical techniques for treating injuries and infections related to sex. But their treatments often depended on the patient's gender, social rank, or even assumptions about their moral character, which sometimes caused harm instead of healing. Roman farmers also connected sex to the land. They believed human fertility could influence crops, and so they timed planting and harvesting with their own sexual activities. Some agricultural manuals even gave instructions on how farmers and their wives should behave sexually in different seasons to ensure good harvests. For Romans, fertility wasn't just about children, it was linked to the health of the entire farm. Entertainment in Rome often had sexual elements woven into it. Gladiator fights, theater plays, chariot races, and public festivals weren't only about competition or drama, they also offered erotic excitement for the crowd. Performers in these shows often worked as sex workers too, and the venues themselves became places where people could meet for sexual encounters. Pleasure and spectacle were tightly connected in Roman entertainment. Roman writers left behind poems, stories, and histories that give us a close look at how people really felt about love and desire. Writers like Catullus, Ovid, Propertius, and Martial poured out their emotions in their work, describing love, jealousy, heartbreak, and passion in ways that feel very personal, yet also reflect the culture of their time. Through their words, we see how Romans struggled with the same feelings and relationship problems we still face today. Religion also absorbed sexual ideas from the many cultures Rome conquered. Egyptian, Greek, Syrian, and Germanic traditions all added their own practices and beliefs, which mixed with Roman customs. Some mystery cults like those dedicated to Mithras, Isis, or Dionysus offered very different views of sex and pleasure that sometimes clashed with traditional Roman values. Economics played a huge role too. Sexual services were recognized as a form of business, fully regulated and taxed by the Roman state. Prostitutes had to pay taxes, brothel owners paid fees, and concubinage was legally recognized. The government didn't just tolerate these practices, it benefited financially from them. This meant that Roman policies about sex weren't shaped only by morality or religion, but also by the empire's desire to make money. Even social mobility in Rome was tied to sex. A relationship or scandal could lift someone's status or completely ruin it. Sexual reputation wasn't just a private matter, it could decide someone's fortune in society, politics, and business. In Rome, sex and power were often tied together. A beautiful slave might gain freedom by becoming her master's lover, while a freeborn citizen could lose honor, wealth, or even their life if caught in a scandal. Marriage was not just about love. It could raise entire families to new heights of power, or destroy them if things went wrong. A careless affair could end in exile, financial ruin, or execution. Romans were also inventive when it came to intimacy. Archaeologists have found devices made of bronze, glass, and other materials that were clearly designed for sexual use. Many other items, made of wood or leather, have rotted away, but their remains suggest a wide variety of tools created for pleasure, birth control, or to treat dysfunction. Roman doctors and pharmacists sold potions and preparations meant to spark desire, increase performance, or affect fertility. Some worked, others were dangerous, but people kept trying, proving that concerns about love and passion are as old as humanity itself. Sex was also a weapon of conquest. In the provinces, sexual violence and forced relationships were common. Roman officials and soldiers often took local women as concubines, and these unions produced children who did not always fit neatly into Rome's legal or social system. Conquered peoples had to adjust to Roman sexual customs, yet were usually denied the protections that full Roman citizens enjoyed. Intimacy here wasn't about choice, it was about control. Even in death, sexuality had a place. Some tomb inscriptions praised marriages that were believed to continue into the afterlife. Burial sites sometimes contained objects linked to sex, and certain funeral rituals included sexual elements thought to guarantee fertility or vitality beyond the grave. To the Romans, sexuality was not just part of life, it was woven into their understanding of eternity. Now imagine walking once again down that marble corridor of an ancient Roman house. This time, though, you understand what the whispers behind those walls really meant. The beauty rituals slowly poisoning wealthy women as they chased the fashion of pale skin. The marriage contracts that treated love like livestock breeding. The slaves whose bodies were not their own, used and traded at will. The children married off before they were old enough to grasp what marriage meant. The endless rules dictating who could touch whom, when, and how. Rome gave us roads, laws, literature, and architecture that still inspire awe. But its systems of intimacy were built on inequality, on ownership, and on violence. The Romans weren't monsters, they were human beings shaped by their own culture, just as we are shaped by ours. What they saw as normal, we see as cruel. Yet when the volcanic ash of Pompeii froze their world in time, it also froze a mirror for us. That mirror reflects the uncomfortable truth. Sexuality has always been tied to power, politics, and hierarchy. Those Romans lying in their final positions remind us that the distance between their world and ours isn't as wide as we'd like to think. We've just become better at hiding inequality and exploitation behind polite customs and modern laws. Their whispers reach us even now, not in Latin, but in the universal language of desire, mixed with fear, cruelty, and hope. They remind us that intimacy has never been innocent, that love has always carried power, and that every culture's sexual rules reveal what it truly values and who it sees as fully human. As standing in the ruins today, you could almost hear those voices echoing through the stones. Their secrets were buried in ash but never silenced. They live on, reshaped in new languages, disguised in new customs, but always as restless and troubling as the human heart itself.